President Donald Trump has unveiled an historic peace deal between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, which the US helped to broker. Here he is announcing it.
After 49 years, Israel and the United Arab Emirates will fully normalize their diplomatic relations. They will exchange embassies and ambassadors and begin cooperation across the board and on a broad range of areas, including tourism, education, healthcare, trade, and security.
Only two Arab nations, Egypt and Jordan, have previously signed peace deals with Israel. Let's hear from Israel's Prime Minister.
This is the greatest advancements toward peace between Israel and the Arab world in the last 26 years, and it marks the third formal peace between Israel and an Arab nation.
Good morning. It's so good to see you. I hadn't been up here in 4 weeks, so it's really good for me to be here. And I'm glad that you've chosen to be here as well. And for those of you that are watching online, we're so glad that you chose to connect with us as well in this moment. The title of my message is captured in that headline, Middle East Peace Deal Shocks World. Now, I'm referring to an event that occurred 10 days ago, Thursday, August 13th, 2020. And this peace deal was a deal between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. The headline says that this deal shocks world. Now, I must confess, I really think that's an exaggeration. That's my headline, I put it there, but I admit it, it's an exaggeration. More accurate headline would have said, shocks some in the world. Because I'm sure that there are many in the world that haven't even heard about this peace deal, and there are many that have heard about it and say, it doesn't shock me, no big deal to me, doesn't affect my life. That's somebody else's good news, I guess, but it doesn't relate to me. Now, I'll tell you, if you lived in the Middle East, you heard about this deal. You couldn't miss it. And if you lived in the Middle East, it would shock you. But we don't live in the Middle East. We live in East Texas. And I wonder if 10 days ago, or even in the last 10 days, if you heard about the deal, the peace deal. And I wonder if it shocked you. I wonder if you sense that the people around you heard about it and were shocked and were talking about it. My guess is probably not. Now, in America, the Middle East, this deal between Israel and the UAE, it was in the news, and I watched for it online, and it was there. It just wasn't very prominent. And then I, with interest, looked for my Marshall News Messenger the day after the deal was announced to see if it would be in there. So I opened up the Marshall News Messenger, and the headline was, "Back to Class, Hallsville Marshall returned to school. Harlton ISD reports first student case of COVID-19. Well, this is a local newspaper. That's their job, is to promote local news. But I wonder if the peace deal's anywhere in there, and so I looked. It didn't take me long to get through the first section. And to my surprise and to my joy, there it was on the back page. UAE Israel to establish full diplomatic ties. I don't know how many people read it, but those that read it, you could say they heard about it. I'm not sure anybody that read it really understood that this is really shocking news. Now, you could be aware of it. You might think that's nice, but you still might be thinking, but doesn't shock me, doesn't affect me. That's a whole other side of the world. That really doesn't have to do with me. I want to tell you this morning, yes, it does. It very much has to do with every one of us in this room and everybody that's watching online. And I'll tell you why. God has revealed in the Bible that Jesus is coming again. He is coming back to this earth. And God has revealed in the Bible that there are two specific prophecies that must be fulfilled before he comes. And this Middle East peace deal relates to those two prophecies because, as I hope we see this morning, this Middle East peace deal could be a major event that God uses to get us closer to the fulfillment of those two prophecies and to the return of Christ. So what I want to do this morning is try to explain more about what this Middle East peace deal is, explain more about the prophecies, those two prophecies, and then how they relate so that we leave here today with excitement and encouragement that God really is at work preparing the world for the return of Christ. So what is this Middle East peace deal? It's a deal between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. We're going to put a world map up here because I think many of us may have heard of Israel, but we might not be as familiar with the United Arab Emirates. Now, just to get our perspective, here's where you live, right here, okay? The United States, good old Marshall right about there. But this peace deal took place between two countries. Let's put an arrow up there in the part of the world that this arrow is going to point to. There it is. That's the Middle East. And now we're going to zoom in on the Middle East in this next map. And here in this part, this arrow points toward Israel. The other arrow points toward the United Arab Emirates over there on the eastern side of the Arabian Peninsula. Now, the name United Arab Emirates may not be as familiar to you as the two major cities of the UAE. Maybe you've heard of these cities, Abu Dhabi and Dubai. They're pretty famous. And I just want to show you just one picture to kind of give you a feel of what this country is and what it's like. It's a picture of Dubai. That's Dubai. It's a spectacular city. It has a skyline that's second to none in the world. In fact, that tall building is the tallest building in the world. And what that picture tells us is that the United Arab Emirates is an economic powerhouse in our world. And I was reading one Jewish Israeli writer this week that says, from a human perspective, this deal is a match made in heaven. The economic power of the UAE combined with the advanced technology of Israel could make these two nations two of the most powerful and prosperous nations in the world. So that gives you a little feel for the dynamic of this deal from that perspective. Okay, I want to go back to my headline. Middle East peace deal shocks world. I've already said it didn't shock everybody in the world, but it did shock some for sure, and for two reasons. One is nobody saw it coming, and the second is it is historic. Whether it plays out in terms of Bible prophecy, it is historic today from every perspective. Now, when I say it shocked the world because nobody saw it coming, that's an understatement. This was a deal worked out by President Trump, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, and the leader of the UAE, Mohammed bin Zayed, or I knew I would forget how to pronounce his name. But anyway, you check me out on that. His first name's Mohammed. All right, bin Zayed, I think is his name. All right. Those three men knew about it, and a very tight inner circle of these three men knew about it. I mean, overall, even their governments didn't even know about it, let alone their countries. And when this was announced, it was a shock to everybody in Israel, the UAE, the Middle East, and for those that were paying attention around the world. Now, the second reason it was such a shock is because it was so historic. There's never been anything like it in the Middle East, nothing even close. I mean, there were a couple of other deals referred to in the opening bumper this morning. In 1979, Egypt, to the west of Israel, made a peace deal with Israel, and Jordan, to the east of Israel, made a peace deal. And they were legitimate peace deals, but they were what some writers have called cold peace. There wasn't a warm relationship with Israel, just a cold peace. We won't attack you. But this deal between Israel and the UAE is totally different. It is a warm peace. I mean, they're going to exchange embassies, ambassadors. They're going into full trade between each country. They're going to have open flights between each country. They're in total cooperation on every level. Cooperation with security, cooperation with energy, water, health, COVID. I mean, they are full on in friendship and cooperation with one another. This is historic. There's never been anything like it related to Israel in the Middle East. Nothing even has compared. Now, for those of us that know about these prophecies that I referred to earlier, there's a third reason why this is a shock. It is to me because it just kind of took me back when I saw it and said, oh my, could this be the breakthrough that we've been praying for and watching for to fulfill the prophecies that God has given us that must be fulfilled to lead to the coming of Christ? And the reason this is so important is because the more you and I are thinking about and praying for the coming of Christ, the better our lives will be. There is something transforming about focusing on the return of Christ. Jesus said that. Notice what Jesus said in Mark chapter 13, where we read these words. He said, "Be watchful, stay awake, and pray, lest coming suddenly he finds you sleeping." There's a lot in those words right there. Jesus himself said, related to his coming, be watchful, watch, stay awake, stay alert, look for the fulfillment of the prophecies that will lead to my coming. And as you do, stay awake. What he means there is stay awake spiritually. Don't go to sleep spiritually. Now, you know what that means because we've all been asleep spiritually. Some of you walked into the room today asleep spiritually. You're not doing good spiritually. Your relationship with God isn't what it should be. You're struggling when it comes to prayer. You're struggling when it comes to just following Jesus. And you're drifting in your spiritual life. You're asleep spiritually. Jesus said, stay awake. Wake up spiritually because I'm coming. You need to watch. You need to stay awake spiritually. You need to pray. Pray for my return. Pray for the day that I will come back to the earth and reign as king. Because I'm coming suddenly. I'm coming and I'm going to catch the world off guard. Because if you're not watching and staying awake and praying, he might find you sleeping. Now, this has nothing to do with whether or not you have everlasting life. If you've believed in Jesus for everlasting life, you have it even if you're spiritually asleep. But I want to ask you, if you've believed in Jesus for everlasting life, how do you want him to find you when he comes? Do you want him to find you awake spiritually or asleep spiritually? You know, whether we're watchful or not could directly influence where we are spiritually in our lives today. These are the words of Jesus that tells us why this is so important, what we're continuing to look at this morning. Now, I mentioned that, and Jesus mentions we need to be watchful. we need to be watchful right now today for the two prophecies to be fulfilled that must be fulfilled before he comes. We need to be watchful toward two specific prophecies, and they are found in these two passages, 1 Thessalonians 5, verses 2 through 4, and Daniel 9, verse 27. All week long, up until yesterday, I was planning to go over both. Yesterday, around noon, I realized we got all we can handle just with the first one. So that's what I'm going to focus on this morning. The passage in 1 Thessalonians 5, verses 2 through 4, where Paul, under the inspiration of God, wrote these words to the Thessalonians, and God has preserved these words for us right up until today. Here's what he wrote. The day of the Lord will come just like a thief in the night. For while they are saying peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them. Now, for teaching purposes, I'm going to take out the middle two lines. We'll come back to them. I'm just going to focus on the first two and the last two lines just to take it a step at a time. The day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night, then sudden destruction comes upon them. Let me explain those words using this timeline. The day of the Lord is a term that represents the coming of Christ. It's a day that refers to the beginning of the end time events, which begins with an event called the rapture. And I've pictured the rapture as an arrow going up. That represents an event that's coming where Jesus will descend down from heaven into the clouds, and those that have believed in him for everlasting life will be taken up off the earth to meet him in the air. Immediately after the rapture occurs, just immediately, sudden destruction will come upon the earth. There will be a war that breaks out that begins a 7-year period called the tribulation. The tribulation will last for 7 years. At the end of the tribulation, Jesus will return to the earth, represented by that arrow pointed down, and he will establish his kingdom upon this earth. So that's behind the verses that we read, or the part of the verses that we read. Let's go back to them. The day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night. That refers to the rapture and the beginning of the end time events. Then sudden destruction comes upon them. As soon as the Lord comes, catches the world off guard, sudden destruction of the tribulation, starting with the war, will begin. Now I want to go back to the passage and put those two lines in that I left out. The two lines say, while they are saying peace and security. So let me read the whole thing and pay attention to those two middle lines. The day of the Lord will come just like a thief in the night. For while they are saying peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them. Now let me take what I just read and put it in the timeline. Here's peace and security. What Paul wrote was this, and I've illustrated in the timeline. While they're saying peace and security, while the world is saying we have peace and security, that's when sudden destruction will come, which is the beginning of the tribulation. And that will be preceded on that very day by the rapture, which begins the day of the Lord. So what we want to especially focus on is the prophecy that says there's a day coming where the world will say, finally, we have peace and security. Now, you probably don't have to know too much about world problems to know that the biggest problem in the world is the Middle East. I mean, our nation's been over there, sending troops over there for decades, trying to fight wars and solve problems in the Middle East. I mean, it's the hotbed of trouble in the world. And if you're going to have peace and security in the world, it has to certainly start with the Middle East. It doesn't end with the Middle East, but certainly if you've got peace and security in the Middle East, at least as we look at the world today, the world's going to feel like it really is peaceful and secure, finally. Now, this is something that some of you, especially as I've talked to you personally, you need to listen now. This is when the world says we have it. It's not the same as the world saying we want it. You hear that? Because the world's been saying, especially since 9/11, we want peace and security, we want peace and security, we want peace and security. And we've been hearing that for almost 20 years now, over and over again from world leaders. But there's a difference between saying we want peace and security and saying we have it. This prophecy is talking about the day when the world says we have it. Finally, we have peace and security. That's not happening in the world today. It's certainly not true in the Middle East. Let me put the map of the Middle East back up and give you a crash course on the problem in the Middle East. These are all Muslim countries up here except one, Israel. They're all Arab Muslim countries except Iran. And when the Jews came back into the land of Israel through the 20th century, that didn't go over well with any of those nations that you see on the map. They hated the presence of Jews there in that land. In 1948, the Jews in Israel declared their independence as a state. The state of Israel was born according to their declaration. We now exist as a state in the land of Israel. And how did that go over with the surrounding nations? They were so angry and so mad that they waged a war against this newborn nation. And Israel fought that war. And the only explanation that I can give as to how Israel won that war is God. Only God could have caused the victory that Israel gained over all those surrounding Arab nations. Well, that didn't end the hostility. 19 years later, in 1967, these surrounding nations waged another war against Israel, famously known as the 6-Day War. Israel won that war as well. And there's only one explanation to explain how Israel could have won that war. God. It was the work of God. Because God had prophesied in other prophecies that in the last days, Israel would be back in their land as a state. And God has watched over them and protected them from the hostility of the Arab nations around them. No peace and security in Israel, or in the Middle East for sure. Now in 1979, something very dramatic happened. There was a revolution over there in Iran, over there in the upper right-hand corner of the map. There were Muslim ayatollahs of a Shiite brand of Muslim that took over the country of Iran. And from the very beginning, they had slogans. You've all heard them because these slogans have affected our country in a number of ways. Death to Israel. Death to America. Coming out of Iran. And they're still proudly and prominently spouting those slogans today, the leaders of Iran. But here's another thing that many of us in America don't understand. I want us to understand it. Iran is not an Arab state. They are Persians. They're of a different race than the Arab race of these nations. They're of a different race, and they're really of a different religion. Now, they're all Muslims, But Iran has a different brand of Islam. It's called Shiite Muslim. The rest of them have a brand of Muslim called Sunni. And they don't see eye to eye. As a matter of fact, Iran not only has a goal to destroy Israel and destroy America, Iran has a goal of taking over the Middle East and dominating those Arab Sunni nations. Now, if you're one of these Arab Sunni nations, you look at Iran and realize we're no match for Iran. They're powerful and strong. We cannot possibly, or there's a possibility if they came after us in a war, we could not withstand Iran. Now, in recent years, this escalated rhetoric and action of Iran to try to build nuclear weapons has caused these Sunni Arab nations to say, what are we going to do? We need help. We need an ally. They didn't make any treaties with Israel, but let me tell you something. They've had their eye on Israel because Israel is one of the most powerful countries in the world. And they know that if we're ever going to stand against Iran, we may need Israel's help. Well, that's a background to tell you about the climate of the Middle East. One certainly not of peace and security, but one of hostility between nations. Now, that is a background for what I want to share with you about three very significant dates, three events that happened on these dates. The dates are May 21st, 2017, May 14th, 2018, and August 13th, 2020, which is the event that prompted this message today. Now, what I want to do as we go through these dates, what I want you to see, and here's the key word that I'm trying to communicate, it is momentum. Momentum. The prophecy that we read in 1 Thessalonians 5, it hadn't been fulfilled. The world isn't saying we finally have peace and security. But what I want to share with you is we can see momentum toward someday the fulfillment of that prophecy. So let's first think about what happened on May 21st, 2017. President Trump took office in January of 2017. 4 months later, on May 21st, 2017, he made his first foreign visit. And where he chose to visit is so significant. Let me show you where he chose to visit. That arrow is pointing to a city called Riyadh. It's the capital of Saudi Arabia. And President Trump asked for a meeting, and here's a picture of the meeting, with the leaders of the Arab Muslim nations. 55 nations were represented in that room to hear what Donald Trump came to share with them. This was strategic on his part because his goal was to hopefully be used to bring peace to the Middle East, and he knew that it started right there in that room. That was his hope as he spoke. Now, I'm not going to play for you the whole speech. It's too long. I would encourage you to look it up and listen to it. It's pretty fascinating in light of what we're considering here today. But I have selected 1 minute. 1 minute. I want you to listen for 1 minute, and I want you to listen to these clips of what he says and think about how interesting and significant what he says is in light of where we are 3 years later from the time that he said it. And how significant what he says is in light of the prophecy that we just read in 1 Thessalonians 5 about the call, or the world saying peace and security. So listen real close to this 1 minute of what he had to say.
I stand before you as a representative of the American people to deliver a message of friendship and hope and love. That is why I chose to make my first foreign visit a trip to the heart of the Muslim world. Our vision is one of peace, security, and prosperity in this region and all throughout the world. At the same time, we pray this special gathering may someday be remembered as the beginning of peace in the Middle East, and maybe even all over the world. For decades, Iran has fueled the fires of sectarian conflict and terror. It is a government that speaks openly of mass murder, vowing the destruction of Israel, death to America, and ruin for many leaders and nations in this very room.
Okay, the sound's a little muffled. He said peace and security. Did you hear that? He said, I hope that this will be remembered as the beginning of a movement toward peace in the Middle East. And he said, Iran is the threat, the common threat to all of us, and we must stand together against that threat. All right, so that was May 21st, 2017. 1 year later, May 14th, 2018, a huge event occurred, and the event is captured in this next map I want to show you, where the embassy, the United States Embassy, which had been in Tel Aviv in Israel, was moved to Jerusalem. In 1995, Congress, the Senate, and the Congress, in a huge majority vote, said the United States should move our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem because Israel says that's their capital. We need to recognize them and legitimize them as a true state with their capital in Jerusalem. So the United States Senate and the United States House overwhelmingly voted to move it. For 23 years, each president in office signed a waiver every 6 months to put it off, to put it off, to put it off, to put it off. And that went on for 23 years. Why did they vote to put it off? Because they were afraid of the uproar that it would cause in the Middle East if America recognized Jerusalem as the capital, officially recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. On May 14th, Donald Trump announced, it was an official ceremony to announce that he wasn't going to sign that waiver this time, and that the capital would be moved to Jerusalem to follow what the Senate and the House had voted on in 1995. So the day came, and here's a little clip from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, where he tells you how he feels about this.
Last December, President Trump became the first world leader to recognize Jerusalem as our capital. And today, the United States of America is opening its embassy right here in Jerusalem. May the opening of this embassy in this city spread the truth far and wide, and may the truth advance a lasting peace between Israel and all our neighbors. God bless the United States of America, and God bless Jerusalem, the eternal, undivided capital of Israel.
May this movement of the embassy be a catalyst to advance peace between Israel and our neighbors. I'm repeating what he said. That was his vision, that this would legitimize Israel, and the Arab nations would say, they're really there. The United States officially recognizes them. There's no sense us thinking that they need to go away. We need to deal with them and face them and try to make friends with them. That was Netanyahu's hope on May 14th, 2018. Momentum momentum, because when we come to August 13th, 2020, what happened 10 days ago? That was the breakthrough. That was the breakthrough that Israel had been looking for, President Trump had been looking for, that many in the world had been looking for, that just one nation would step up and make a formal peace treaty with Israel. Now, here's what's important. President Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, their vision is not that this is the end. It's only the beginning. Because if there's going to be peace in the Middle East, it's not going to come from two nations making peace. It's going to come from the region making peace with Israel. So I want you to listen to just 30 seconds of what President Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu announced just 10 days ago about their vision as to what this can lead to. This is exciting, so listen close. The sound isn't the best, but try to listen to what they say.
By uniting two of America's closest and most capable partners in the region, something which said could not be done, this deal is a significant step towards building a more peaceful, secure, and prosperous Middle East.
Israel and the UAE are two of the most advanced countries in the world. Together, we'll transform the region and forge an even better future for our people. This is a future of peace, a future of security, and a future of prosperity.
Okay, I gave you the wrong video. I'll try to correct this in the second service. What I was doing there was showing a video of how they mentioned peace and security. I've got another video to come, don't I? Matt? That's the last video? Totally confused. Huh? Okay. All right. Okay, I'll just say it verbally, and I'll try to confirm this maybe later. They announced that this is just the beginning of future relations with other nations. So, let's go back to our...
By uniting two of America's closest and most capable partners in the region, something which said could not be done, this deal is a significant step towards building a more peaceful, secure, and prosperous Middle East.
Israel and the UAE are two of the most...
I'm so sorry. I really am. Sorry about the confusion, but you get the point, okay? The point is that both President Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu said this is just the beginning of other nations. We are very hopeful and confident that other nations will follow the lead of the United Arab Emirates. So let's go back to our 3 dates, and again, I want you to see the momentum. The meeting with the Arab Muslim leaders, the opening of the embassy, and the breakthrough that we've been looking for and praying for, that one nation made true peace with Israel, hopefully is the catalyst for other nations to follow, so that we can get to the day that the prophecy will be fulfilled. And it is this: the day of the Lord will come just like a thief in the night, for while they are saying peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them. Now, I want you to notice the very next thing that Paul says in this passage in Thessalonians. This is significant to you and me. But you, brethren, are not in darkness, that this day should overtake you as a thief. After this morning, there shouldn't be one of us that could say, I didn't have any idea. I didn't know this was coming. When the rapture occurs, you say, well, it totally caught me off guard. You can't say that after today. You've been alerted to the fact that God has done something dramatic here to set the stage for the possible soon fulfillment of the prophecy that we've looked at today, so that if that day comes in our lifetime, you and I would say, I wasn't in darkness. That day didn't overtake me as a thief. And that you'll be fulfilling what Jesus called us to be doing in these days and going back to it, to be watchful, to stay awake and pray, lest coming suddenly, he finds you sleeping. The book of Revelation ends with these words: surely I am coming quickly to which John, as he writes the book, replies with these words, Amen, even so come, Lord Jesus. There's a song that was put to those words, and I think it would be a great song for us to close with this morning. This will be our closing prayer as we sing it to him. Even so, come.